Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Connor Smith. I'm president of the Boss Group, and I'm joined today with Jackie Schaefer, vice president of Cella Consulting. And we're very pleased to bring you today's webinar on the in-house creative services industry report brought to you by the Boss Group, Cella and InSource. Here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to go over a survey overview, as well as cover what is new in this year's report in 2013, go into some key takeaways, additional information and resources, as well as some questions and answers at the end of the presentation. We've already been provided with some questions and answers in advance by some people, so we really thank you for that. If you have questions as the presentation goes along, please feel free to enter them into the questions box in your webinar template there. So I'm very happy to turn over the presentation to Jackie Schaefer, Vice President of Cella Consulting.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Connor. As Connor mentioned, we're going to start with the survey overview. I'm really excited to share this is our third year doing this survey, and each year we have grown in the number of respondents, starting with 168 in our first report, which was published in January 2011, growing to 361 last year, and upwards of 435 this year. If you haven't yet downloaded the report, you can find it at creativeindusтрyreport.com. What's special about this report and our surveying process is this report is only responded to and reported against the responses of, if you will, in-house leaders. And what that means is they are not from an agency and they are not individual contributors. And we do that through two questions at the beginning of our survey. Anyone who responds other than what is circled in orange here will be disqualified right away. Second question, that's a qualification question, is what is your role? And these are the titles of individuals that we move forward with and include in our survey. So we had 435 people respond that they work in-house and that they were one of these titles. While designers and writers and other individual contributor positions certainly have a lot of insight into their creative team and somewhat the pulse of the organization, they don't have the same level of insight into staffing, budget, and future plans for the creative organization. And that's why we limit our responses to those types of roles. Due to the confidential nature of the information that's being shared in the survey, and based on our desire to encourage high participation, we can't be certain that a singular creative organization is not represented more than one. So we do ask survey respondents to provide their organization name and or email address to help us reduce that. We then search for duplicate responses from the same organizations and determine based on our understanding of that organization whether multiple responses are warranted, because some, especially in larger companies and in universities, there's multiple creative teams. And if that's the case, we keep those responses. If we know it's an organization that only has one and we actually have a question in the survey that asks, are you the singular creative organization? We'll eliminate one of the responses. So typically, if we disqualify a response, we disqualify the more junior respondent survey response. So that's a little bit about our methodology. Let me tell you how the survey is organized. It's mostly set up in about 5 sections. We talk about where things get done, who gets it done, what gets done, how it gets done, and then what the challenges are to getting it done. In addition to the data that we provide, there's 5 articles in this year's survey report that are called Perspectives of the Field, from the field rather. You're going to find those because they're the blue ones. They stand out. Great articles this year. Barbara Moser wrote about inspiring and motivating your team, a constant challenge in-house when we're limited to 2 fonts and 2 colors. Matt Stein talks about the pros and cons of outsourcing, and that's a great article. They all are, but Matt's experience very much aligns with the one I personally had, and it gives you a great unbiased point of view about what's great and where the challenges are of outsourcing. Sarah Hauge, she talks about developing an in-house video capability. What's special about that is, one, video is becoming more of a standard in in-house creative teams, and it doesn't always require headcount. Sarah talks about that. Elizabeth Wood from Villanova, she talks to scaling when headcount is not an option. Many of you have gone through limited hiring experiences lately, and when you can't get additional headcount, technology is often an opportunity for efficiencies. unexpected path to strategic partner. Tracy from Elsevier, she's got a great story here about a team that was once very large that got reduced in size and decentralized across the organization. And in that path, they actually became more valuable to Elsevier. So great stories from creative leaders in the field. Each page of the report, the data pages, looks like this. At the top, you're going to find qualitative survey results. So we tell you kind of the key takeaway from the graph below. In addition, we layer in some best practices that might be are related. The question is exactly how it was worded in the survey. So you can see exactly how what respondents were replying to, and then right below here, you'll see what they responded with. And again, it's just the qualified respondents' responses. We're also sharing with you, when you see N equals at the bottom of the pages, that's the number of responses for that specific question. While there's 435 qualified responses total, not everyone answered every question, and some people were disqualified for certain questions based on previous responses. In orange, to the right of the chart, you'll see key takeaways from the data, and other times you'll see related data points from other questions that we asked that aren't represented in a chart, or data cuts. So we looked at, for example, here you see it says that 84% of creative teams have 20 or less team members. So that's a key takeaway from the chart for us. In addition, if we took that 10 or less team members, 69%, what percentage are 6 to 10 team members, 2 to 5, and 9? So you get additional detail there on the right. And lastly, each page also shows you additional resources, including blog articles. We have 62 questions in this year's survey. That's an increase of 100% since we started doing this survey in 2010. We add new questions based on feedback that we hear from folks like yourself, as well as from what we're hearing around the industry at networking events and through consulting engagements here at Cella, through staffing events with the Boss Group, and InSource's roundtables. The questions are pretty high level in order to help you have some guidance in making your business decisions. We don't want to ask very specific questions because that could require too much of a time commitment, which would reduce participation. In addition, we want to ensure our questions are worded in a way that creates the best apples-to-apples environment possible. With that said, let's share what's new in 2013. The first new question we added was whether groups are mandated. So do your clients have to use your team, or do they have the option to go outside, or even potentially to start their own creative group internally? And you can see here that 35% are mandated. And the rest have some loose mandates, or kind of mandate by default. What's interesting to me, and actually a really great place to be, is the bottom one. People aren't mandated, but they have to go outside, they have to go through the creative team. That's a great place to be. You still get involved with the agencies, but you have support through an agency. In addition, we asked, as I mentioned on a couple previous pages ago, small team breakouts. So last year we only surveyed on whether your team had 10 or less members. But that's such a big chunk of in-house teams. 69% are 10 or less. What does that look like if you break it down further? 6 to 10 team members was 30% of them. And then another 30% was 2 to 5. And 9% of in-house teams that are represented in the survey are teams of 1. In addition, a new question we asked this year was whether the team is centrally located. And about 3/4 of in-house teams are centrally located. The remaining are spread across multiple locations. 15% are domestic, and 8% of respondents had teams in international locations as well as domestic locations here in the United States. This next question was added based on quite a few people's questions last year. They wanted to know how common it is for individual contributors to be paid overtime. And we found that 35% of individual contributors are being paid overtime. And that includes both company FTEs who are labeled as non-exempt employees who are paid hourly and then have overtime on top of that. And it also includes source staff, so the people that are coming in, for example, from the Boss Group or other staffing companies. Those folks are eligible for overtime. A very interesting type of pay is premium pay, and there's probably a lot of different ways it can be termed. But when we talk about premium pay, we're talking about pay for work that occurs on weekends or extreme hours, so your non-core business hours. And business hours, we all know, might end at 5:30, but it's not atypical for a creative team to work past 8 o'clock at night. But really, at a certain point, it does become extreme. And are you compensating individuals for those extreme hours? The next new question we asked, and I should point out, at the bottom of each of these slides, you'll see the reference page. That way, if you have the full report, you know where you can go to find additional information on these data points. So we asked about account management. 44% of in-house teams have dedicated account managers. They may be hybrid account managers in that they're hybrid project managers as well, or they might be just straight account managers. But what we're asking here is, do you have someone who's dedicated to serving the client versus the designer who's asked to be a manager or the creative director who's asked to be a manager? The next question we asked is around self-proofing. Does your team use self-proofing software to collaborate with clients and collect and track feedback? It's about 50-50 right now. And the most people who are doing it are using Adobe's Acrobat's built-in reviews and comments functionality. Another tool that's out there that is more automated is Meta Communications Approval Manager. It's a really strong tool. And there's other ones as well. But that's what that 7% might be using, or the 5%. Either built into a grader system, or they're actually using a dedicated tracking system for approval. The next one we added was, who provides your Mac support? And we added this question because it is a source of pain for most creative teams who are Mac-based. Most people are getting support through their IT department. What we didn't survey, and might have been more telling, is what is the quality of that support. But you can see most people are doing that. In addition, almost 20% are doing it themselves. 12% have the luxury of having a Mac specialist on their team. That is more common in larger teams, as you might imagine. One thing that we have heard in our conversations in the past year here at Cella is that with the advent of the iPad, and especially executives wanting iPads and everyone having an iPhone nowadays, that support companies is getting better. So hopefully we'll continue to see that, hear that type of feedback. In the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that we surveyed for the first time is InDesign or Quark, your primary desktop publishing software. I don't believe any of us are surprised to see that InDesign was the response, but it is interesting to note that 92% of teams are using InDesign primarily. Or maybe it's interesting to note that 8% aren't yet, and what are they missing? For a couple of years now, or for the past 2 years, we've asked, are you a chargeback group? This year we want one level further down. If you are a chargeback group, what cost are you required to cover or recover through your chargeback? The top two responses are, there is no specific recovery goal, so the creative leader is not told what they're supposed to recover. They're just charging back and they're collecting money, and somebody's happy that someone's collecting money. The next one down is a flat number is provided by finance or someone else, but the creative leader doesn't know why they're asked to collect that money. So, for example, they have to collect $500,000 this year. That's their goal, but it's not related to an expense. The ones below that, beginning with personnel salaries and lower, those are people who are required to recover money based on expenses. Personnel salary expenses are kind of the least or the lowest amount you have to recover, and then each level lower here is one more thing added. So you add the personnel costs plus personnel benefits. The salary plus benefits, I should say, is the second one. Then you add operating costs and overhead and other things, and even 3% of groups have to profit. So this is an interesting look at data this year. source of pain we're hearing, but the survey results don't quite represent what we were hearing, is folks not having money for training anymore. And maybe they just have a lot less money. But we asked for the first time, does your team have an established training budget each year? And 45% of creative leaders do. Another 25% don't have an established budget, but they are getting their request approved. So that's a good place to be. 70% are getting requests or getting training. And when they are doing training, it's going towards the 4 categories that are boxed on this page. Industry events and conferences, 63% of groups get to attend those. Online training like lynda.com. If you're not using lynda.com, Lynda, check it out after this webinar. It's a great low-cost way to provide your team excellent training. Soft skills coaching, and then 25% of folks are doing software training led by a live instructor, maybe bringing someone in from Adobe as an example. And the last kind of new piece of information we asked this year, and really it was a deeper dive into the information, was in company sizes, we segmented it deeper. So 43% of our respondents are more than $1 billion in revenue. But if we break that down further, 10% of respondents are Fortune 100. That's representing 44% of the Fortune 100. So we've got lots of big companies in this data set. And then additional 15% of the Fortune 101 through 500 are represented, for a total of 20% of the Fortune 500 is in our report. An additional 18% of companies breaks out to 1 billion to 5 billion. Now I'm going to put my former head of creative services hat on and tell you what my key takeaways are in this report. The first one is in reporting structure. We segment reporting structure into 2 categories. Departments that we consider to be strategic and value added versus non-strategic or shared services departments. If the department you report into, or the person, the CMO, the head of communications, advertising, or something, one of these groups that may own brands or allows you to be independent, these are great places to be in the best way for your group to be able to partner with your clients versus being seen as a service or a commodity. If you're in one of these blue departments, operations, shared services, IT, finance, manufacturing is one of the responses, these are considered to be non-value added. And, it is what it is. There are a significant number of big companies putting creative services, marketing communications, whatever you call your creative team, into a shared services department. You can become a strategic partner. It's just more challenging. The next thing that I found very interesting this year is that staff size, the year-over-year change, didn't really change much from last year. About 50% again remained flat, didn't get any new headcount. So for some groups, they've been quite a few years without new headcount. A little more than a third increase in size. And last year, about a third, a little bit more than a third increase in size, and 15% decrease. So at least only 15% decrease is, a change from a couple years ago. Where there is a difference this year is that folks aren't feeling as satisfied with their staffing level. Last year, folks felt they were appropriately staffed more often than they did this year. The next one is overtime. We all know overtime is part of our world in creative. We can't do the work till our clients get it to us. That's our challenge. Overtime percentages remained pretty consistent this year from last year. Still, what's driving the overtime, there was a pretty big change this year. An increase of 30% of respondents said the reason why we're having overtime is due to insufficient staffing. So looking back at the previous page, we heard that we're not getting more staff, and here we're seeing it's becoming a problem. We're working overtime to make up for it. Something to be aware of to avoid burnout for your team. Next one is time tracking. Those folks who know me know that this is kind of my favorite thing to talk about, and one of the things I feel is imperative to the success of a creative team's growth. So of course, this would be something I would pull out. The key takeaway for me is that the majority of creative teams are tracking time, 55%. And larger your team is, the more likely you are tracking time and using software to track time. So the call out here on the right-hand side, if your team is 31 or more people, 84% of you are using software to track time. That's fantastic. In addition to asking whether you're using a project management system or a workflow tool or a DAM, we asked what systems are you using. There wasn't a huge majority anywhere in these. In fact, no singular response received more than 15% of the survey results. The most popular was customer homegrown solutions underneath the project management side. And this was a very common way for these tools to be constructed in the past. That you kind of did it yourself. You used FileMaker, you made it on the web, or you did it in SharePoint because your company requires you to use that as your intranet. Other folks responded with Basecamp and Microsoft Project. The one thing I would share here is these aren't true creative project management workflow tools. You can do project management in them, but you can't capture metrics and time in the way you can in a creative project management system. And then the true tool, off-the-shelf tool that was the most respondents indicated was Workamagic. It's a great tool. There's many other tools out there that have similar benefits, so there's many things you can look at, and in the resources on page 23, you can find a link to a list of tools. But my point here for you is a lot of people are using tools, and these are the main ones they're using. There is opportunity in the industry, I can tell you, to move forward in our use of tools, and where a lot of groups are choosing to make their investments right now when they can't get a head count, they have been able to get money for a tool. On the right-hand side, you'll see the 4 popular digital asset management tools that are being used. Creative teams aren't using digital asset management systems as much as we might expect, but our understanding is that's going to grow in the next few years. So something to put on your strategic plan is to consider whether a digital asset management tool is right for your team. I want to point this one out because we reported on chargeback status. Are you a chargeback status? And there's yes, no, and then there's we are for something. There's a big difference between 2012 results and 2013 results of 11% between people who say no, we're not chargeback. And what I want to enforce or reinforce in this conversation is that we don't believe it's a reflection of an industry shift. Really, we just think this is based on more people responding this year and having a greater sample size. The last key takeaway for me is we are consistently as creative leaders faced with the same challenges year over year. The top 4 this year were the same top 4 last year. If you're challenged with affecting your clients' behaviors, coming up with career paths for yourself or your team, gaining respect for your internal clients, feeling valued in your organization and supported by your leaders, you're not alone. New this year, the top 5 is adequate funding for staff. We've heard that a couple of times across the last 20 minutes, and I see that as a key takeaway in this report because it did come through in so many different questions. From here, I'd like to share with you and ask Connor to step in for a minute some additional information and resources that we can provide to you. And then we're going to get into the question and answer period. So as you guys know, the report is published by the Boss Group, Cella and InSource.
Thanks, Jackie. And just a reminder, if you haven't yet, please post your question in the question box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can before our time is expired here today. The Boss Group is an award-winning, and by award-winning, we are proud to say that we're the only creative human capital solutions provider that for the past 3 years has been awarded Best of Staffing on both our talent and our client side by Innovero. And we've been providing award-winning creative talent for the interactive, creative, and marketing communities since 25 years ago. And actually, coincidentally, today we just had our 25th year anniversary celebration. So if you'd like more information on how we can help you out, whether it be a freelancer for a day, perhaps all the way up for a full-scale managed services option to meet some of your human capital needs, please feel free to reach out to either myself or your local Boss Group representative. I'd also like to invite invite everyone on the call, and please pass this around, to our Creative Connect networking happy hours. They're every other month. Our next one is going to be on July 10th. To get information on the location near you, we have them in 7 cities throughout the country, so and the venues tend to change frequently, I'll say. So to get information on the date and where you can go and pass this along to a friend, it's creativeconnect.com. And they're really wonderful events for creative of all disciplines to get together and exchange information. You'll get creatives from agencies, creatives from in-house, creatives from pharma, talking to creatives for financial, copywriters talking to web designer, and great dialogue in a very informal setting. And it's just a great chance to network.
Cella is a consulting, training, coaching, and networking company. We help in-house creative leaders and only in-house creative leaders with financial modeling, organizational design, talent management, etc. across this graphic. A space where we've had a lot of success lately is in technology and systems and helping folks set up to become more scalable when headcount isn't an option. We just announced yesterday that we are going to be in Chicago, October 9th and 10th, for Beyond the Creative 3. Our first Beyond the Creative 3 was launched this past March and sold out. So we encourage you to check out beyondthecreative.com to learn about the conference and sign up before we sell out again. I'd also like to draw your attention to the Creative Executive blog if you're not familiar with it, cellaconsulting.com/blog. Subscribe on the right-hand side, you can see where it's circled. Published weekly, and it's topics that are pertinent to creative leaders, written by former creative leaders and consultants in the space. The third member of our group is InSource. In-source.org is the website, and InSource provides the network. And again, they're like Cella; they only focus on in-house leaders, and that's what makes them different from other groups. And they share professional experience, they're sharing knowledge, best practice, really to help empower creative leaders to run their businesses more effectively. What's fantastic about InSource is it's free. So if you go to their website, you can register there, part of their online community. In addition, they have events throughout the country related to real-life in-house creative challenges. And you can see their mission right here on the screen. With that, we're going to head into questions and answers. I'll start with a few that were provided in advance.
I should mention, some of the questions that were provided in advance we've already answered through the course of the presentation. So here's the remaining ones. We were asked, what specific types of work are handled by the in-house team versus what's sent off-site to ad agencies? This is the level of specificity we surveyed this at, and you can find it on page 12 in the report. The most common thing that is outsourced to agencies is campaign strategy and design. And specifically, what I mean by that is, it's kind of that tier 0 work. If you do tier your work, we talk about tier 1 being, requires creative development, first-time use, never done anything like it before. You have to sit down and have a creative brief. You've got to come up with new creative concepts. On the opposite end of the spectrum would be tier 3, and that's production work, highly templated work. Outside of the typical tiers we talk about, we call something tier 0, and it is that campaign strategy. Many in-house groups don't have that capability on staff, and it's why it is the most common thing to be outsourced. The next question was around volume. An individual asked about their team creates 1,800 core projects a year, and then they make versions of them in different languages, equaling to about 7,000 to 8,000 projects a year. And there was a question around, is the data reported in a way that I can understand how other people are doing this too with translation? And we don't survey we do survey number of projects, but we don't survey what are the tiers in those projects, what percentage of them are tier 1 versus tier 2, which are iterative works, which are translated versions. The truth of the matter is, based on my experience, very few creative teams are tracking this in a manner that would be easily reported. And to ask them to report against that might decrease participation. And then the next question we received was around creative directors. What percentage of in-house creative teams have a dedicated creative director? I think this is a great question. We did not survey it this year, and we're going to look to include it in next year's survey. Another question we received was, what are the ratios ADs to writers to graphic artists, et cetera? This is something we're asked often. In fact, a lot of times it's, how do you know how many account managers to staff? And the truth of the matter is, it's really way too specific to your organizational needs to report against it. We could ask people this, but people's responses would vary so much that to report an average would be irresponsible of us. And then lastly, another translation question was around how many groups have in-house editors or translators. And we did not include that this year, and we'll certainly consider it for 2014. I'm now going to head over to the questions submitted online today. Let's see. Okay. First question. From what geographic regions are the responses, metropolitan areas versus smaller cities? We did not ask people to report their geographic region. I can say, though, based on information available to us, that the majority, and the large majority, 95% plus, are domestic to the United States, the responses. Regarding contingent workforce, I'm curious if Cella has seen an increasing interest from corporate in-house teams that need to be more compliant with correct Department of Labor classifications / utilization of contingent labor. So this, okay, there's a little bit of additional information. This is actually a huge topic right now in the industry, and I'm going to let Connor answer it because while Cella has seen it, Connor is as close to an expert in the space as I know.
So the answer would be yes. It's an excellent question. We have seen a tremendous uptick at the Boss Group and Cella on their engagements as well. And I think one of the things that this relates back to, if you have a chance to read the cover page, which Andy Brentis, the president of InSource, Jackie, and I put a little message out there, it's that creative leaders really need to know how to speak the language of the business outside of creative, and a large part of this are the impacts that are being had on human capital right now. Independent contractor compliance, and I believe that's part of the question here, has become a huge issue. Under the current administration, the IRS has ramped up tremendously, and it's something that if your company is engaging independent contractors, you may have felt pressure on that. The upcoming Healthcare Act, referred to as Obamacare, is going to have a tremendous impact on contingent labor and workforce policies. So it's really important that in-house creative leaders get familiar with the terminology and the waves that may be impacting the different waves or the different ways that you may be able to utilize freelance talent and full-time talent that are acting as freelancers. So the short answer to a question there is absolutely we've seen a tremendous impact on that. And I personally, I know Jackie as well, would love to have a further conversation with anyone and how this may impact the makeup of your current team.
And I will say we've seen a swing of organizations that are decreasing their FTEs in favor of contingent labor. So the reason why most companies tend to be doing this is to decrease their personnel costs, and they still have a similar cost, but they're moving it to a different line on their P&L, which is more favorable to shareholders. So we are seeing that in-house teams are decreasing their FTEs in favor of adding contingent workers. There was a question around the number of unique in-house agencies. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this year we have 435 qualified responses. We have done our best effort without requiring respondents to disclose their names and their organizations to create I want to make sure I say this correctly. We've done our best effort to ensure there aren't duplicate responses from the same organizations, and specifically the same creative organizations, because as I mentioned, some companies have multiple creative teams, and we're aware of those. That being said, there could be some duplicate responses in here, but I do believe that it is negligible and doesn't impact the overall results of the findings. All right. What positions are most commonly included in the creative services teams? You know, we didn't directly ask this question because I think what we would hear would very nicely tie back to the question on page, or the chart on page 19 in the report about service offerings. We ask, what of the following services does your department provide? And just to give you a high-level overview, 99% graphic design or create or provide graphic design. Therefore, they have graphic designers. Production design, brand management are the next two in the top three, if you will. Web design, 72%. Copywriting, proofreading, editing falls in the low 60s. And then e-learning is only 17%. That's the lowest. So if you take a look at page 19, you can relate the service offerings back to the typical positions that you would have to provide those services.
And Jackie, I'd like to follow up on that as well, because one of the common things that I hear in relation to this question when speaking with creative leaders regarding human capital is they're hearing from their clients perhaps certain skill sets or services that their clients would like, whether it be iPad development, mobile development. We've even had clients talk about they want illustrators to come in to do mind mapping. And you may or may not have that person on your team. A wonderful way to go about that, I guess you have two choices. Is one, you could invest in a current person on your team with training. That may not be the most time efficient way to do it if you have a client that has a need. Another way is to work with a provider and get a freelancer in there and kind of do a test project. And if it goes well, you have a client that's happy, and also you may have a testimonial to build that service line. So that's a wonderful way to utilize contingent labor to expand the offerings of an in-house group.
However, the next question is for you as well. Does the Boss Group have locations in Denver, Colorado?
We do not have a brick-and-mortar location in Denver, Colorado. However, we do nationwide placements for direct placement throughout the country.
Gary's got a great question. What are the top 3 or so reasons a company would want a creative services team to charge back? Page 30 of the report addresses this. It has benefits of a chargeback system. And the responses that were listed as the most significant benefits of a chargeback system are: it encourages the efficient use of time and resources by the creative department. So charging back creates accountability within the creative department. The second one is it creates accountability and transparency into the financial management of the department. So the first one is good use of time and resources. The second one is good use of money and making sure that your internal clients understand how the company's funds are being spent. And then the last one is, or the third one, is it encourages efficient use of time and resources by clients. And that's one that is, I think, kind of a favorite. And folks who aren't in a chargeback system always hope that'll be the case, that charging back will create or affect behaviors in their clients. And it can, but I'll also put out there that sometimes it's just money and they don't care about whether it's $100 an hour or not. They're still going to be inefficient for you.
And from a human capital perspective, one thing to add on that, Jackie, which is intertwined to many of the points that you just made, when we're working with clients at the Boss Group, and intertwined throughout this report, there's a lot of comments about in-house leaders having trouble getting the staff that they need to get the work done. If you are indeed tracking time and have a chargeback, that's a very positive sign for us in the conversation that you have an infrastructure that's able to justify having additional headcount to put against projects. So, it's certainly not a magic bullet, and I'm not saying it is, but a very good way to be able to justify additional headcount, whether they be contingent or full-time, is to have a solid chargeback system in place that you can allot that expense towards.
How do you create value in your team is a question. And this is probably a question that requires more time than any of us have in today. And it's a huge challenge. And I'm going to flip it around a little bit from how Kelly asked it, but how do you make sure the value of your team is recognized? Because hopefully your team is creating value. It's making sure that other people know about it. From there, Kelly, what I would recommend is taking a look at the resources we have available on the value recognition page. We actually, on page, let me make sure I get it right for you, Kelly, page 39, it identifies the top 8 or 10 values that in-house creative teams feel their clients recognize them for. In addition, there's some related resources there around the top 10 value propositions and positioning your team to be the vendor of choice. So I'm going to refer you to page 39. All right. So a question here by Lyle is, and I'm going to paraphrase it here. Lyle's goal is to get a full-time employee because he feels that a temp, using a temp intermittently for peaks and valleys, is sacrificing the quality of work in his team. And so how does he substantiate rehiring somebody versus using temps? I guess the first thing I would say from personal experience is you have to be able to substantiate that your work is even. You know, if you're having peaks and valleys in your work, a temp is the right way to do it. That being said, a temp can sometimes be difficult to ramp up for short needs. You know, if it's something you only need for 4 or 8 hours, you might need to require overtime out of your team to create less stress. The other thing to do is to build out a temp pool. So one thing I know that the Boss Group does is with their clients, they will know what type of temps that people need seasonally or just to have on call, make sure that talent is vetted, and have a couple of them available in the pool so that when a client calls and says, I need someone who can do X, who meets our company's requirements, they can send them rather quickly and reduce some of that stress. Connor, what else would you add from the staffing side of this?
The only thing I would add to that, Lyle, and for everyone else on the webinar as well, is many times when trying to justify additional headcount, we get hung up on what the cost of the headcount is. A great way to go about this, and I'd be more than happy to share some information on this additional if you email me at c.smith@thebossgroup.com, Lyle, and everybody else, is to do an opportunity cost analysis of what the cost is of that position not being filled. That could be tied to work that you would be doing for the company that is not getting done currently. There's many different ways that you can go about this, but if you're able to make a business case that it actually costs more over the course of a year to not have that seat filled than it does to actually fill it, because that's what, many times human resources and finance people get caught up on, what's the salary and the burdens, and, that's going to cost me X. But it can be, depending on the data, that your department has, it can be really, really robust to make a case that it's actually costing you more not to have a full-time hire. Now, I would love to talk to you more because I agree with Jackie that there are different ways that you can utilize contingent labor that I believe you can get equal production out of a full-time versus a freelancer depending on what you're doing. It just really depends on how you're engaging them in your department.
Jamie speaks about, he knows we do roundtables, and both InSource, the Boss Group, and Cella do roundtables. Has there ever been any discussion on holding one around staffing and process? They're curious as to how other departments are set up, what their workflow looks like, et cetera. I'll certainly pass that on to InSource, who they're actually on the call as well, that's something folks are looking for. I'll also mention that, in fact, we piloted this, the Boss Group and Cella did last November with 10 companies of in-house teams of 50 or more people, and we did exactly what you're suggesting here, Jamie. We spent an entire day looking at each other's org charts, the tools that we use, our challenges, our funding models, et cetera. And Cella and the Boss Group, we are currently determining what we're going to be doing in our fall roundtable series. We've just finished our spring one, or actually we're finishing it tomorrow and Friday in New Jersey and Philadelphia. But this is one of the topics we're considering, so please stay tuned. We might be doing that. We hope you'll join us. Carol's looking to learn more about the chargeback process. Carol, Cella's website is robust with this information. I would suggest heading on to our blog section, so cellaconsulting.com/blog, and just type in chargeback, one word, and you'll see in the search box, and you'll see every article that's related to it. In addition, this is one of my favorite topics, so I'd love to talk to you more. Feel free to contact me after the conversation or after today's webinar, and we can set up time. Okay, is it unusual for in-house clients to assign a project to an in-house designer and then pull the job after seeing preliminary designs and given and give the project to another designer, either in-house or out. I can't speak to that from an industry point of view. It's not something that regularly comes up in my conversations with leaders. Can you, Connor?
No, I cannot.
I would say, though, from my experience of leading a creative team, that I wouldn't say it's best practice. That's not going to develop the individual who made the first preliminary designs. I instead would encourage partnering that person with someone else and/or tightly coaching them. If you have hesitancy that this person may not be able to deliver ahead of assigning it to them, potentially assign the project to 2 or 3 people and make it a collaborative process so that person can grow through the process being kind of out on his own in that situation. So with respect to hiring staff, how do in-house graphics departments keep salaries low and competitive within the government projects versus the higher private sector salaries?
It's an interesting dynamic that you're in there. I don't know if I would advise on how to keep salaries low. I would kind of flip the question and say, what are the other things that you can do to keep employees engaged outside of compensation? One of the things that we hear quite frequently, and Jackie mentioned that we view as a positive, is training. Creative professionals view their career certainly as an ongoing project, so to speak, where they constantly want to be learning new skills. They constantly want to be adding pieces to their portfolio. Just by being a creative, there's a level of curiosity that comes along with that. So if you're not able to give pay raises, which you feel may not be the equivalent of the private sector, there perhaps could be some budget, or maybe you need to demand it, where you're able to give creatives some robust training and they're advancing in their career that way. Other things like that, and I'm sorry if these seem like obvious statements, but any type of flexibility. We know creatives are very motivated by flexibility, autonomy, attire when it comes in the workforce. Perhaps you can advocate that if your creative department is having to follow the same dress code, maybe there's some flexibility there. Even little things to making your space fun. Creative departments many times sit in, dare I call them, stodgy type environments, and there's certain things as creative leaders that can go a long way in terms of making your space fun that could, I wouldn't say compensate for lack of pay, but certainly make your place a more palatable place to work if indeed pay is an issue. Jackie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's great. The only thing I would say is, one thing that's kind of special about creatives is, while we're all driven by money to a certain extent, I think creatives are, as a group, less so than other professions. And that opportunity to compensate via benefits and training and flexibility actually does go a long way with this group versus others.
And to add to that, there is, I believe it's on page 13, there's an excellent link to a blog posting on the Cella blog about selling your in-house advantage. And I think that would tie to this question. Many times, while the compensation may not be as great as a designer or whatever in-house person, or creative could get externally at an agency, there's many selling points for in-house groups that you have. Perhaps you have access to tier 1 type work that the person would not be able to work on if they're at an agency. They may get kind of stuck with one client doing more production type work. Work-life balance. It's amazing that 75% of in-house people work 5 hours of overtime or less. I don't think many agencies could trump that. And then perhaps you're working for a government agency or a company that has a strong mission. And as Jackie said, creatives are connected to things and missions, outside of just a paycheck. So that's 3 strong selling points. So I heavily encourage you to check out page 13 and read that blog.
Liz has asked a question that is one I hear all the time, whether in our consulting engagements or people asking follow-up questions from the report, and it's, is there a comparison available between the size of the staff and the number of projects they're doing a year? The first thing I would say, Liz, is that projects are not apples to apples. Everyone, there might be a creative team of 100 people who only does 2,000 projects a year because their projects on average are 100 hours each. There also might be a creative team of 10 people that does 2,000 projects a year because they do a lot of 5-hour projects. So projects as a way to compare yourself is actually not a good barometer. That being said, I know it's of interest and everyone always asks it, so I do want to respond directly to the question as well. And we attempted to do so on page 17, the page where we ask how many projects did your group complete in 2012. The orange text to the left of the chart, it states that 85% of teams that are small, so 20 or less people, do 2,000 projects or less. So if you are 20 or less people and you're doing more than 2,000 projects a year, you are in a minority. Large teams, so those folks who are 50 or more is how we define large teams, either do 70% of them are doing more than 4,000 projects. The mid-sized teams, those folks between 20 and 50, the results were really across the board. Some were doing 1,000 projects a year, others were doing 8,000, some were doing 4,000. There was no majority response. So I feel really good about the fact that if you're a small team and you're doing more than 2,000, you're an anomaly. But when you get over 20 people, it's really not consistent. The question from Christine is, what percentage of organizations are nonprofit educational institutions in your survey? From there, I would say turn to the end of the report to see this in the full information. But you'll see that, pardon me, education and government and not-for-profit comprise of 23% of our results, and that's on page 44. In addition, if you go to page 45, you can see that broken down further across the different industries. On the cost recovery question, this is from Tracy. What is included in all overhead? Does that include allocations from other departments? It's really what your company calls overhead, and that could differ. In my experience, yes, it did. It included the allocations, that paid for the HR team, that paid for the IT team, et cetera. Anyone who is an administrative role for the company, not revenue generating, they have to be paid for somehow, and their costs were generally allocated out. At the minimal level, overhead typically includes rent, utilities, and like office supplies for the company, things like that, general cost expense. Usually it does also include an allocation of cost for non-revenue generating employees. Okay. Once departments, and this is from Cicely, once departments are mandated to use the in-house creative teams, how is it enforced? That's a great question, and for the groups that are enforced, many of them are government or government contractors. So really, I think it's enforced because of the repercussions of not using them. It could be pretty severe for the company. And then other companies, more in the private sector, I can't speak to how it's enforced there, but I do know that it's not perfect, the system, and that things do get through, and potentially people are reprimanded, but I don't know how strong that reprimand is, and it probably differs per company.
Yeah, I think in the private sector, the only way to truly enforce it is by making sure that your department is communicating so well with the company about your services and advertising your services and very well known. Unfortunately, I've been on the other side of that call where companies have come to us and saying they do have a mandated in-house department, but they're not satisfied with the work and wondering what avenues that we could provide to do that. So I think the only real true way of enforcement is to make sure that, one, you're getting your message out that your services do exist, and secondly, making sure that your companies, and perhaps this is through, or your clients, perhaps this is through surveying, are very happy with the service levels that you're providing.
Sherry asked, what are the top KPIs or key performance indicators that in-house teams are measuring? And I'll speak to best-in-class in-house creative teams. I believe utilization is a top metric, so the percentage of time that your team is spent in billable time. Now, even if you're not a chargeback group, that's still applicable. How much of your time is spent on client or project-facing work? That's probably the number one type of metric. The other things that I see commonly and recommend, projects and time spent per client, and type of work that you do. This next one's for you, Connor. Is Boss a global provider of freelance and full-time creative resources?
Not as of today, Jennifer. We do have aspirations to be all throughout the world, but currently right now we're only in the domestic United States.
John asked if we have a sense of the percentage of in-house groups who are in a single location versus multiple locations. Not only do we have a sense, we have an answer. 77% of the respondents indicated they're in a single location. June would like to learn more about categorizing the work her team does. Tiering. On Cella's blog, we definitely have an article all about tiering. And June, I will send that to you after the meeting to make sure you get it. I also believe there is a link to it in our report. In our follow-up email that we'll send to everybody, we'll include that link to the article so everyone gets it as well. All right, we have just enough time for one or two more questions. What have you seen regarding the range of chargeback rates, blended rate, or specific rate per person? And this is asked by Tim. Great question, Tim. I'm going to answer the second part first. Very, very rarely have I seen specific rate per person. I actually think it's the opposite of a do you want a client saying to you, well, I don't want Jackie to work on my work because she's only charging $50 an hour and she's junior, and that means she's not good, versus I want Connor to work my work because he's $80 an hour and that means he's better. Or the reverse. I can't deal with Connor. He charges me way too much. I want Jackie to do my work because she's cheap. You, as the creative leader, want to determine who's doing the work, so definitely don't do rates by a person. So rates are typically done as a blended or service. So Connor and I both could be graphic designers and have the same rate, and two other people could be web designers and have a different rate. There, I think it's appropriate to make different rates. You don't want to have too many different rates because that just becomes an administrative nightmare. You want to have different rates where truly the cost of doing business in that function is significantly different than in another function. So let's just use, for example, and I'm just going to throw out numbers that really aren't based on facts, so don't use that from here. If your e-learning designers make $100,000 a year and your production artists make 45, there's a significant cost of doing business that is different, and you will have different service rates there, and that makes sense. If you have work done in another country, for example, India, you may charge less for work being done there. You may not, because you want to make the choice around whether the work is done domestically or in India. You can go both ways there. Now, how are people doing it more often? That is asked in the report. And just give me 1 second. Connor, do you have anything to add about the first part of that question while I look this up?
I wish I did, Jackie, to give you some time, but I think your answer was spot on.
I apologize I'm not getting it quickly for you, but I promise you it's in the report, and if you flip through to the chargeback section, which is in how it gets done, you will find that answer. And one last question.
You know, and I'm funny, it's funny that I took this long while you're looking for it. But the other thing Jackie made that's very important to not do it per person is it really gives you flexibility to bring in freelancers by position. So if you're billing it by person, you need to bring in another freelancer. That becomes tricky if that freelancer is a graphic designer and they're used to paying a certain rate for a certain person. When you're doing it by position, that is the benchmark that you can communicate with your freelance provider, saying that I have to be within this cost because that's what I charge my clients for.
And that was perfect amount of time, Connor. 44% of respondents to our chargeback use a blended rate. 30% do a service-specific rate, so by function, as we were mentioning. 10% do flat project rates, so more of a rate card approach, and 17% were other. The blended rate approach is the most simplistic to implement. And then to your question, Tim, about rates, pages 34 and 35 of the report go into detail on the rates. Okay. We'll ask one more question as it is directly related, or answer one more question. You just indicated charging back at the rate of $100 per hour. Do you have knowledge of the national average chargeback rate? And that's on page, I would go with 34 there to kind of see where most groups are charging back. I would say right around $80 an hour is the average of in-house groups. You'll see that 30% are 66 to 80, and 27% are 81 to 100. So that 80 mark is right about average. If you're in a large metropolitan area like New York City, the cost of doing business is greater, so you probably have higher rates. If you employ a lot of high-priced talent because you do a lot of higher-end work versus production-level work, you're going to be higher, and the reverse is also true, or the opposite is also true. So that's all the time we have for today. We really want to thank you for joining us and let you know that the recording of this webinar will be made available later this week, and you'll receive an email with that link so you can share that with your team or with others as you feel appropriate. In addition, if you'd like these slides, please contact my colleague Matt Lang. He's at m.lang@cellaconsulting.com. I'd like to thank you again for your time, and in addition, to those of you who filled out our survey this year, I want to thank you for taking the time to do that and allowing us to create this resource for our industry. And I look forward to those of you who didn't do it this year participating next year.
And one follow-up to that, unfortunately we didn't get to some questions, but Jackie and I sincerely mean this. Jackie, please feel free to reach out to Jackie or I directly, and we'll be sure to either point you in the right direction or answer the question directly ourselves.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.